Soyuz 11 blasted off June 6th. After a record 24 days in space, cosmonauts Dobrovolsky, Volkov, and Patsayev were returning to Earth in triumph when their cabin pressure failed. They were given heroes' burials at the Kremlin Wall.
Elon Musk revealed the terrible truth about the 3 Soviet cosmonauts who were brutally killed. Space missions are some of the most intense endeavors humans have ever tried. Sadly, many of the things in the space industry are held as top secrets, including the truth about disasters. In a recent sit-down, space travel guru Elon Musk has uncovered the terrible truth about one such sensational disaster in which 3 Soviet cosmonauts were brutally killed. Stay tuned to find out exactly what happened in one of the most horrible disasters ever witnessed by humans. Elon Musk and the Russian side of the space industry have had a fascinating history. For example, Musk, the founder of SpaceX, and Dmitry Rogozin, the Director General of Russian space agency Roscosmos, has had a long-standing rivalry. The two have traded insults and jokes on social media over the years. In 2014, after the United States imposed financial sanctions on several Russian officials, including Rogozin, in response to Russia's internationally condemned invasion of Crimea, Rogozin publicly rebuked the US by suggesting that NASA use a trampoline to send astronauts to orbit. At the time, the US was dependent on the Russian Soyuz spacecraft to reach the International Space Station ISS. However, in May 2020, after SpaceX successfully launched its Crew Dragon spacecraft carrying NASA astronauts to the ISS for the first time, Musk responded to Rogozin's barb by saying the trampoline is working at a press conference after the launch. If that's not the height of trolling. In September 2021, relations between Musk and Rogozin appeared to be improving when Rogozin praised Musk in an interview with CNN and invited him to his home for tea. However, their relationship soured again in May 2022 when Rogozin made a statement to Russian state media accusing Musk of supplying Ukraine with Starlink terminals and arming fascists. Musk responded by joking on Twitter that he could die under mysterious circumstances following Rogozin's statement. Despite their public sparring, both Musk and Rogozin are leaders in their respective space industries and have made significant contributions to space exploration. Their rivalry reflects the competitive nature of the space industry and the ongoing tensions between their respective countries. However, the rivalry between the two men is only a minute reflection of the fierce competition between their respective countries. The space rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union, commonly known as the space race, had its origins in the ballistic missile-based nuclear arms race between the two nations following World War II. The space race was a 20th century competition between the Cold War rivals to achieve superior spaceflight capability. The launch of Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite by the Soviet Union in October 1957, set off alarm bells in the Eisenhower administration and created intense fear and anxiety among the US public that the Soviet Union had surpassed the technological achievements of the United States. In response to perceptions of Soviet technological success, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, was established in October 1, 1958.
NACA is to become part of a new agency, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration,
as a primary federal agency responsible for aerospace research and the civilian space program. The early years of the space race were characterized by a series of Soviet successes. In April 1961, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first man to enter Earth's orbit in a single-pilot spacecraft called Vostok 1. The Americans were not far behind, however, and 1 month later, in May, Alan Shepard became the first American in space, piloting a 15-minute suborbital flight. In February 1962, John Glenn became the first American to enter Earth's orbit. Early Soviet successes in the space race led US President John F. Kennedy to announce the inauguration of the Apollo program.
In my judgment, this nation's orbital pioneering in space is of such historic stature,
which pledged to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. On July 20th, 1969, American astronaut Neil Armstrong became the first human to walk on the moon as part of the Apollo 11 mission. The space race continued throughout the 1970s and 1980s, with both countries launching numerous missions to explore our solar system and beyond. However, by this time, both countries had also begun to cooperate on some space initiatives. For example, in July 1975, American astronauts and Soviet cosmonauts docked their spacecraft together in orbit as part of the Apollo-Soyuz test project. However, while the country tried to outdo the other, both countries have recorded massive disasters, which resulted in the loss of lives. On the United States side, two of the most well-known disasters are the Challenger and Columbia Space Shuttle accidents. On January 28, 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger broke apart just 73 seconds into its flight, killing all 7 crew members on board. The disaster was caused by the failure of a seal on one of the solid rocket boosters, which allowed hot gases to escape and damage the external fuel tank, causing it to explode. On February 1, 2003, the Space Shuttle Columbia disintegrated upon re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere, killing all 7 crew members on board. The disaster was caused by a piece of foam insulation that broke off from the external fuel tank during launch and struck the left wing of the shuttle, damaging its heat shield. This damage allowed hot gases to penetrate the wing during re-entry, causing it to disintegrate. Both of these disasters were devastating for NASA and the families of the astronauts who lost their lives. They also led to significant changes in NASA's safety procedures and culture to prevent similar accidents from happening in the future. On the Russian side, one of the most devastating disasters was that of the Soyuz 11, which resulted in the death of 3 cosmonauts, Georgy Dobrlovsky, Vladislav Volkov, and Viktor Patsayev. Georgy Dobrlovsky was a Soviet cosmonaut who commanded the 3-man crew of the Soyuz 11 spacecraft. He was born on June 1, 1928 in Odessa, Ukraine, which was then part of the Soviet Union. Dobrlovsky, along with his crewmates Viktor Patsayev and Vladislav Volkov, became the world's first space station crew aboard Salyut-1. They spent 23 days aboard the space station, where they performed experiments and explored the then many unknowns of human space habitation. Tragically, on June 30th, 1971, Dobrlovsky and his crewmates died during the re-entry of the Soyuz 11 spacecraft. Dobrlovsky was posthumously awarded several honors, including the title of Hero of the Soviet Union, the Order of Lenin, and the title of Pilot Cosmonaut of the USSR. His ashes were placed in an urn in the Kremlin Wall necropolis on Red Square in Moscow. Vladislav Volkov flew on the Soyuz 7 and Soyuz 11 missions. He was born on November 23, 1935 in Moscow, Russia, which was then part of the Soviet Union. Volkov graduated from the Moscow Aviation Institute in 1959 as an aviation engineer at the Korolev Design Bureau. He was involved in the development of the Vostok and Voskhod spacecraft prior to his selection as a Cosmonaut 1. He flew aboard Soyuz 7 in 1969, where he acted as a flight engineer and tested welding techniques in space and multiple launching. On his second space mission in 1971, Volkov was assigned to Soyuz 11, along with his crewmates Georgy Dobrlovsky and Viktor Patsayev. They became the world's first space station crew aboard Salyut-1. Tragically, Volkov and his crewmates died during the re-entry of the Soyuz 11 spacecraft. Volkov was posthumously awarded several honors, including twice being awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union, first on October 22, 1969, and posthumously on June 30, 1971. He was also awarded 2 Orders of Lenin and the title of Pilot Cosmonaut of the USSR-1. His ashes were interred in the Kremlin Wall on Red Square in Moscow. Viktor Patsayev was born on June 19, 1933, in Aktyubinsk, Kazakhstan, which was then part of the Soviet Union. Patsayev served as a design engineer on the Soyuz 11 mission, along with mission commander Georgy Dobrlovsky and the flight engineer Vladislav Volkov. The 3 cosmonauts remained in space for a record 24 days. Patsayev was also posthumously awarded several honors, including the title of Hero of the Soviet Union, the Order of Lenin, and the title of Pilot Cosmonaut of the USSR. For the real truth about the Soyuz 11 disaster, we travel back to the morning of June 30th, 1971. Around sunrise on the Kazakhstan steppes, recovery personnel prepared to meet the crew of Soyuz 11, which had completed a successful 24-day voyage to the world's first space station, Salyut-1. The Soviet authorities and people were delighted to welcome cosmonauts Dobrovolsky, Volkov, and Patsayev home after they broke the world space flight endurance record for 18 days set by their countrymen aboard Soyuz 9 a year earlier. The parachute system of the Soyuz 11 descent module began to deploy as planned at about 10 kilometers altitude, and the main parachute deployed normally. There had been no connection with the crew since before the deorbit burn, but ground crews were preparing for a routine return from orbit. The descent module landed normally in the landing site east of Kazakhstan, which is still utilized for Soyuz landings today. On a lovely day with a clear sky, the spacecraft landed on its side, with recovery forces ready to meet the astronauts. The recovery personnel then secured the spacecraft and opened the hatch. What they discovered inside Soyuz 11 would shock and dismay them, having serious ramifications for the Soviet program and spawning safety changes and equipment that are still in use today. The three-person crew of the Soyuz 11 was killed. Following the Apollo 11 moon landing, the Soviet program approved the Salyut project, which would launch the world's first orbiting space station for astronauts to visit, reside in, and perform research on. Because the Soviets had lost a race to land humans on the moon and were experiencing significant issues with their N-1 heavy-lift rocket, which was required for their own lunar landing missions, they opted to focus on other space firsts in order to stay ahead of the Americans. While the N-1 difficulties were still being worked on, Soviet program leadership opted to focus their spaceflight efforts on long-duration orbital missions. These missions began in June 1970 with Soyuz 9, when cosmonauts Andrei Nikolaev and Vitaly Sevastianov flew for 18 days aboard the last first-generation Soyuz 7K-OK spacecraft, conducting biomedical experiments, Earth observations, and stellar navigation exercises, validating the possibility of future longer flights aboard the Salyut station. On April 19, 1971, a Proton-K rocket launched from Baikonur Site 8124 with the Salyut-1 space station on top, a station based on the Almaz design, which was started by designer Vladimir Chalomy as a military response to the U.S. Air Force's Manned Orbiting Laboratory project. The Salyut station, a fully equipped dry workshop, successfully reached a 200 by 222 km orbit above Earth and was checked out in preparation to host cosmonaut crews 2 years ahead of NASA's Skylab program. The Soyuz 10 mission, led by Vladimir Shatilov, would be the first launch of the new Soyuz 7K-OKS, which includes a probe and drogue, as well as an interior transfer tube. 10 years after Yuri Gagarin's historic flight, the mission was the first time humans were deployed to an operating space station. The spacecraft launched on April 22 and conducted a rendezvous and soft docking with Salyut-1 to begin the first crew stay at the new space station. However, a problem with Soyuz 10's flight computer and altitude control system led the hard dock process to fail. After struggling to retract the dock probe, the crew abandoned the mission, left the station, and deorbited for a return to Earth on April 24th. The stage was prepared for another attempt to deploy people to Salyut-1 after working to understand and overcome the Soyuz 10 hard dock challenges. The Soyuz 11 crew, led by cosmonaut Alexei Leonov, and comprised of flight engineer Valery Kubasov and research engineer Pyotr Kolodin, was completely training and ready for a June 4th launch. As launch day approached, the crew, together with backups Georgy Dobrovolsky, Vladislav Volkov, and Viktor Patsayev, made their way to Baikonur Cosmodrome. A decision was made on June 3rd as a result of an issue discovered during a routine pre-flight medical assessment of the cosmonauts. A crew member, like the Apollo 13 crew the year before, was diagnosed with a last-minute ailment, forcing him to be replaced by his backup. However, the process of the Soviet program differed from that of NASA. The backup crew replaced the whole prime crew. Doctors in Moscow discovered a dark patch on Kubasov's right lung and diagnosed him with tuberculosis in its early stages. Kubasov's diagnosis was incorrect, and he didn't grow ill as a result. According to Alexei Leonov's biography, Kubasov was allergic to a tree insecticide and recovered rapidly. However, the Soviet space program leadership didn't care, and the backup crew was promoted to the primary crew, preparing for what would now be a June 6th launch of Soyuz 11. Georgy Dobrovolsky, the new Soyuz 11 crew leader, was born in Odessa, Ukraine. was a lieutenant colonel in the Soviet Air Force, married with 2 children, and had been selected as a cosmonaut in 1963 along with other Soviet Air Force pilots in Group 2. Dobrovolsky was set to take his first space journey after 8 years in the Cosmonaut Corps. Volkov, the Soyuz 11 flight engineer, worked on the Vostok and Voskhod programs of the Korolev Design Bureau before being named as a cosmonaut in 1966 as part of the Energia Engineer Cosmonaut Training Group 1. Volkov, unlike Dobrovolsky, had prior spaceflight experience as a member of the Soyuz 11 crew in October 1969. Patsayev, like Volkov, was a civilian who worked for the Korolev Design Office. Patsayev, who was born in Aktyubinsk, Kazakhstan and was married with 2 children, was a civil engineer selected for the 1968 Civilian Specialist Group 3. Patsayev's first voyage into space would be on Soyuz 11. Soyuz 11 launched from Baikonur Site 15 Gagarin start on June 6, 1971, and successfully reached orbit. Soyuz 11 and its crew, given the call sign Yantar or Amber, successfully docked with Salyut 1 after 24 hours, overcoming the hard docking challenges that plagued Soyuz 10, though not without some suspense due to the docking taking place out of connection with the ground. When the crew arrived on Salyut 1, they discovered a foul odor in the air and had to replace 2 fans. Because the air had to pass through scrubbers, the crew spent the first night in their Soyuz before powering down to begin their scheduled 30-day stay at the Salyut station. Salyut 1 had 99 cubic meters of pressurized volume, significantly more than the Soyuz 11's 9 cubic meters, and was by far the most comfortable crewed spacecraft ever flown. A docking module with a tunnel and a fitting for the Orion UV Stellar Telescope, a larger forward work compartment with seats, control panels, and video and still cameras, a larger and longer rear work compartment with biological experiments, a conical fitting for more experiments, a treadmill, sleep stations, and a food refrigeration unit were all part of the station. Salyut 1 also had an unpressurized compartment in the back of the ship with systems borrowed directly from the Soyuz design, such as thrusters and a deorbit engine, as well as solar panels that were extremely similar, if not identical, to those on the Soyuz 7K OKS spacecraft. 2 more solar panels were added to the docking module, as well as rendezvous antenna, using a technology that has evolved through the years and is still in use today. The Soyuz 11 crew began biological studies and established a pattern of living and working in orbit. The crew was highlighted on Soviet television and was idolized throughout the Soviet Union. They grew beards and trained on the treadmill to stay fit for re-entry, but discovered that the treadmill vibrated the entire station. Viktor Patsayev became the first person in history to celebrate his 38th birthday in space. Patsayev was also the first person to use an astronomy telescope in space, when he used the Orion telescope to acquire ultraviolet stellar spectra from the stars Vega and Beta Centauri, obtaining data from the stars that could not be obtained from Earth's surface. To maximize research time, the crew slept in shifts, with at least 1 cosmonaut working at all times. Soviet scientists later decided that round-the-clock procedures interfered with the cosmonauts' sleep, resulting in less than optimal performance. They produced Chinese cabbage and onions in the Osis-1 plant growth facility, and Patsayev became the first person in space to operate an ultraviolet telescope, the Orion 1. They employed a lower body negative equipment called Vetter to test the status of their circulatory system, which subsequently evolved into the Chibis apparatus used on succeeding Soviet and Russian space stations, and is still used today on the Russian part of the International Space Station. They took lung function tests and blood samples for further examination on a regular basis. The cosmonauts broadcasted nearly daily television broadcasts of their operations inside Salyut, documenting both their scientific studies and ordinary living aboard the space station. The events were called Cosmovision by Soviet journalists. They voted in Soviet elections from Salyut, becoming the first persons to do so. There were sun observations scheduled. However, the solar telescope couldn't be used due to a broken lens cover. The mission dynamics, however, would shift on June 16. Vladislav Volkov noticed a burning odor and dense black smoke rising from the back of the station. Due to the Soviet program's demand for secrecy, he relayed this to Mission Control using a code word. However, because the ground controllers had forgotten the code word, Volkov was forced to communicate the gravity of the situation in plain language. The little fire was extinguished after the crew had been evacuated to Soyuz 11, and the equipment had been turned off and on. However, the fire and other problems forced the program to reconsider the duration of the Soyuz 11 mission. The decision was made to halt the mission 6 days early, and the crew completed all experiments on June 26th. The cosmonauts concentrated their efforts on putting the station into storage mode and packing for the return to Earth, including some of the high-priority experiment samples, because Soyuz didn't have enough space for all of the items. After some issues with the hatch on the Soyuz spacecraft were resolved, with the help of cosmonaut Alexei Yelislayev communicating with Dobrovolsky and his crew from Mission Control on June 29th at 9:25 Moscow time, Soyuz 11 undocked from Salyut 1 and backed away from the pioneering first space station. Dobrovolsky and his crew, dressed in fabric flight suits identical to those worn by pilots, backed the spacecraft away from Salyut 1 and took images to document the station's condition, a routine similar to what crews have done subsequently with later Salyut stations, Skylab, Mir, and the International Space Station. They prepared for the deorbit burn and the flight back to Earth after leaving the station's proximity. After receiving instructions from Mission Control, Dobrovolsky reported to Mission Control in Russian, "All received. Landing sequence proceeding excellently. All okay. Crew is excellent." The Soyuz 11's deorbit engine fired for 187 seconds at 1:35 Moscow time on June 30th, 1971. The burn was nominal, however, no communications were received from the crew after this point. At 1:47 Moscow time, the orbital and propulsion modules separated from the descent module while the spacecraft was at 116 kilometers altitude. However, the crew on board the descending module had just been put in mortal danger. The shock of the orbital and service module separations caused the pressure equalization valve behind the control panel to activate prematurely due to the explosive bolts connecting them to the descent module all firing simultaneously rather than in sequence. As the spaceship quickly depressurized, the three men had only 13 seconds of useful consciousness to attempt to correct the problem. Dobrovolsky and Patsayev attempted to solve the problem. Patsayev was the cosmonaut closest to the open valve, and examinations later revealed that he may have attempted but failed to seal the valve. Post-accident testing found that closing the valve manually would have taken 52 seconds, significantly longer than the crew had. All three soldiers died about 110 seconds after the module separated. While there was considerable concern in Mission Control due to the absence of communication, radar in Crimea, Ukraine picked up Soyuz 11 on a regular re-entry route, leading Mission Control to believe all was okay. When the hatch of Soyuz 11 was opened, recovery personnel on the Kazakh steppe were the first to realize what had happened. Medics attempted CPR and resuscitation on the guys for several minutes, but they had died more than 30 minutes before. The Soviet public and the rest of the world first learned of the accident through a TASS broadcast that started, "TASS reports the deaths of the crew of Soyuz 11. An investigation into the tragedy and the cause of the crew's deaths was launched almost immediately. While the Soyuz 11 crew lay in state and were posthumously given the Hero of the Soviet Union Gold Stars, NASA astronaut Tom Stafford traveled to Moscow to represent the United States at the cosmonauts' official funeral. Stafford served as one of the pallbearers for the urns of the cremated remains, which were deposited in the Kremlin wall after Premier Leonid Brezhnev, other authorities, and many ordinary citizens paid their respects. After the investigation was completed, work on rebuilding the pressure equalization valves and other parts of the Soyuz spacecraft began, and the disaster's repercussions were felt all the way down to the Apollo program. In a seemingly rare instance of Cold War rivals learning from each other, the Apollo 15 lunar landing crew, Dave Scott and Jim Irwin, chose to wear their A7L spacesuits during the ascent from the lunar surface. An uncrewed Soyuz trip in 1972 verified improvements to the spacecraft, and the crew size was reduced to 2 to accommodate the new Sokol-K launch and entry suit. The suit, dubbed the Space Falcon in Russian, was designed for cosmonauts to wear during the launch and entry stages of each succeeding Soyuz flight, beginning with Soyuz 12 in September 1973. while Dobrovolsky, Volkov, and Patsayev made the ultimate sacrifice 50 years ago today and are the only humans to have died outside the planet, their terrible death occurred at the end of their mission. While it's easy to remember the visible reminders of their deaths in suits, redesigns, and memorials, their work on Salyut 1 opened the path for so many aspects of living in space that we now take for granted that we would have had to learn later if they hadn't. In the end, everyone who's left the planet since that terrible June morning in 1971 owes a debt of appreciation to the Soyuz 11 crew, as do the billions of people who profited from their 24-hour scientific research endeavor.